My mom looked me straight in the eyes, threw my only suitcase onto the lawn, and said, "You'll never own anything in your life." Less than 12 hours later, I was unlocking the front door of a hidden $50 million Malibu mansion that legally belonged to me, and she had no idea it even existed. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. My name is Soellen Mercer, and for most of my life, I believed family always came first. After my father passed away, I stopped thinking about my own dreams. I stayed close to home because I thought it was my responsibility to help my mother keep everything together. I worked long hours, came home tired every night, and did whatever needed to be done without asking for anything in return. My younger brother, Briggs, lived a completely different life. He rarely worried about bills or responsibilities. If something went wrong, someone else always fixed it for him. Most of the time, that someone was me. My mother, Rowena, never treated us the same. No matter how much I helped, she always found something to criticize. If Briggs made a mistake, she defended him. If I stayed quiet, she called me weak. If I spoke up, she said I was disrespectful. I kept telling myself things would get better if I just worked harder. That hope disappeared one evening. Rowena suddenly accused me of stealing money from the house. I stood there in complete shock. I had no idea what she was talking about. I tried to explain, but she refused to listen. Briggs stayed silent, watching everything happen without saying a single word. The argument became louder until neighbors started looking through their windows. My mother didn't care who was watching. She dragged my old suitcase outside, threw it onto the front lawn, and pointed toward the street. "You are not my son anymore," she said. Those words hurt more than anything else. I looked at Briggs, hoping he would finally tell the truth, but he looked away. That was the moment I realized I was completely alone. I picked up my suitcase without saying another word. There was nothing left to fight for. The house I had helped keep running no longer felt like home. I walked down the street with nowhere to go, trying to understand how my life had fallen apart in just a few minutes. Every step felt heavier than the last, but I refused to turn around. I didn't know that someone had been searching for me. I didn't know that by the next morning, everything I believed about my future was about to change forever. I spent the entire night sitting inside my old pickup truck. I parked in a quiet corner of a grocery store parking lot because I had nowhere else to go. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard my mother's voice telling me I was no longer her son. I kept asking myself the same question over and over. How could she throw me away so easily after everything I had done for our family? I had worked for years to keep that house running. I paid bills, fixed problems, and always put them first. Yet none of it mattered. As the sun began to rise, I started my truck and drove without any real destination. My phone had only a little battery left. I thought about looking for a cheap motel, but I barely had enough money to cover gas. A black luxury sedan suddenly pulled into the parking lot where I had stopped for coffee. A man wearing a dark suit stepped out and looked around before walking directly toward me. "Are you Soellen Mercer?" he asked politely. I nodded, unsure who he was. "My name is Lysander Holt. I've been trying to find you." At first, I thought he had the wrong person. "I think you're mistaken," I said. He calmly handed me a business card with the name of a respected law firm printed on it. "No mistake," he replied. "I've been looking for you for several weeks." He asked if we could sit down somewhere private. We walked into a small coffee shop nearby. Once we sat down, he placed a large folder on the table. "What I'm about to tell you may be difficult to believe," he said. I listened quietly. He explained that my grandfather, August Whitmore, had spent decades building one of the largest private real estate businesses in California. I barely knew my grandfather because he had stayed away from our family for many years. I always believed he wanted nothing to do with us. Lysander gently shook his head. "That isn't true," he said. "He stayed away because he saw things happening that he couldn't accept. He told me my grandfather knew how my mother treated me. He watched from a distance and understood that I carried the family while receiving none of the respect. Because of that, he secretly changed his estate years before he passed away. Everything had been left to me. I stared at him without saying a word. He continued explaining that my grandfather had added one unusual condition. I would receive the inheritance only after I had been completely rejected by the people who had spent years taking advantage of me. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Lysander then drove me along the California coast until we stopped in front of massive iron gates overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The gates slowly opened. Beyond them stood an incredible Malibu mansion. "This," Lysander said with a small smile, "is your new home." I sat silently for several moments, staring at the mansion in front of me. Even after walking through the gates, it still didn't feel real. The house was larger than anything I had ever seen in person. Floor-to-ceiling windows faced the ocean, and every detail looked perfect. Lysander led me inside and gave me time to explore on my own. The first thing I noticed was a small envelope resting on a table near the entrance. My name was written across the front. With shaking hands, I opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter from my grandfather. He wrote about the first time he saw me helping my father repair a fence when I was a teenager. He said I worked hard without expecting praise and that he never forgot it. As I moved through the house, I found more letters. One was in the library. Another was in a study overlooking the ocean. Another sat inside a bedroom drawer. Each letter shared a different memory. My grandfather described moments from my life that I thought nobody had noticed. He knew about the jobs I worked. He knew about the sacrifices I made. He knew how often I put other people before myself. The more I read, the more I realized something that completely changed how I viewed my life. My grandfather had been paying attention all along. Not because he cared about money, because he cared about me. For years, I believed nobody saw my efforts. I thought all the long hours, disappointments, and sacrifices had gone unnoticed. I was wrong. Someone had seen everything. Later that afternoon, several professional advisors arrived at the mansion. They introduced themselves and explained their roles in managing my grandfather's companies. The meeting lasted hours. I learned that the businesses were already operating successfully. Commercial properties, residential developments, investment partnerships, and several other companies were producing millions of dollars each year. They showed me reports, contracts, and financial records. I listened carefully, but my mind kept drifting back to the letters. The money was overwhelming. The businesses were impressive. But those things weren't what affected me most. For the first time in my life, I had proof that someone believed in me. After everyone left, I walked onto a balcony overlooking the ocean. The sun was beginning to set across the water. I held one of my grandfather's letters in my hand and read it again. Near the end, he wrote a simple sentence. "I always knew you would become a good man." That was when the emotions finally caught up with me. I sat down alone and quietly cried. Not because I had inherited wealth. Not because I owned a mansion. I cried because the one person who truly understood me was no longer here to see this moment. Across town, my mother and Briggs were convinced they had finally gotten rid of the family's biggest disappointment. They had no idea that my life had already changed forever. They still believed I had lost everything. The truth was that they had just walked away from the most successful person in the family. A few weeks passed, and my new life slowly began to settle into a routine. Every morning, I met with my grandfather's executives. They patiently explained how each company operated and answered every question I asked. I knew very little about running large businesses, so I listened more than I spoke. I didn't want to become someone who depended on other people to make every decision. If my grandfather had trusted me with everything he built, then I wanted to earn that trust. Some meetings lasted all day. I learned about contracts, budgets, employees, and long-term planning. There was far more responsibility than I had ever imagined, but I welcomed it. For the first time in years, I felt like I was building a future instead of simply surviving. I also made a promise to myself. I would not use my money to get revenge. It would have been easy to show my family what I own now, but that wouldn't change what had happened. I wanted my success to come from making good choices, not from proving anyone wrong. While I was moving forward, life at my mother's house was moving in the opposite direction. The bills I had quietly paid for years started arriving one after another. The mortgage payment was overdue. The electricity bill was left unpaid. The water company sent a final warning. Credit card companies began calling every day, asking for missed payments. For years, I had handled many of those expenses without telling anyone. I never wanted my family to worry, so I simply took care of them. Now that I was gone, there was nobody left to keep everything under control. My mother couldn't understand why so many problems were appearing all at once. Instead of asking what had changed, she blamed bad luck. Briggs wasn't helping. He kept saying he had a plan that would fix everything soon. One day he talked about a business idea. The next day he mentioned another quick way to make money. None of his plans worked because he never stayed committed to anything. He continued spending money they didn't have, believing something would eventually save them. The phone rang constantly with collection calls. Letters filled the mailbox. The pressure inside the house grew heavier every day. Even then, my mother refused to admit the truth. She refused to believe that I had been carrying most of the family's responsibilities all along. Back in Malibu, I focused on becoming stronger instead of becoming bitter. Every lesson I learned gave me more confidence. Every decision became a little easier. The executives treated me with respect because they saw I was willing to work hard instead of expecting success to come easily. Slowly, I stopped seeing myself as the man who had been thrown out with one suitcase. I started seeing the person my grandfather believed I could become. Without realizing it, my family had pushed me toward a completely different life. And while they struggled to hold their house together, I was quietly learning how to lead something far greater. Nearly a month had passed since I left home. My days were filled with meetings, paperwork, and learning how to manage the companies my grandfather had trusted me with. I stayed focused on my responsibilities and avoided thinking about the people who had pushed me out of their lives. Back at my mother's house, the pressure continued to grow. One afternoon, a longtime family friend named Corinne Vale came to visit. She had known my parents for many years and had watched my brother and me grow up. She had stayed quiet through many family arguments because she believed they would eventually work things out on their own. This time was different. She could no longer ignore what had happened. When Rowena complained that everything had gone wrong after I left, Corinne looked at her with disappointment. "You blamed the wrong person," she said. Rowena frowned and asked what she meant. Corinne explained that Briggs had come to her several weeks before I was thrown out. He had admitted losing thousands of dollars and was desperate to find a way to cover it. He was terrified that his mother would find out. Instead of telling the truth, he chose an easier target. He blamed me. Rowena immediately turned toward Briggs. At first, he denied everything. But Corinne calmly reminded him about the conversation they had shared. She remembered every detail because she had begged him to be honest before things became worse. Briggs had ignored her advice. The room became silent. As Rowena searched through old folders and bank statements, another truth slowly appeared. She discovered records showing payment after payment made from my personal account. Mortgage payments, utility bills, insurance, property taxes, repairs around the house. Many of those expenses had been paid quietly for years. She had never asked where the money came from because the bills were always taken care of. Now she finally understood. I had protected the family from losing their home without expecting recognition. Tears filled her eyes as she looked through the records. She realized she had accused me without asking a single question. She had trusted Briggs without asking for proof. That mistake had cost her the son who had always stood beside her. For the first time, she truly understood the damage she had caused. That evening, she picked up her phone and called me. I didn't answer. A few minutes later, another call came. Then another. She left voicemail after voicemail asking me to call her back. The next day she sent messages asking for a chance to explain. I never responded. Not because I wanted revenge. I simply wasn't ready. For years, I had lived with the pain of never being heard. Now she was experiencing what it felt like to speak into silence while hoping someone would finally listen. Several more weeks passed before I heard anything about my family again. One morning, my assistant informed me that 2 unexpected visitors had arrived at the front gate of the estate. He asked if I knew a woman named Rowena Mercer and a man named Briggs Mercer. For a moment, I said nothing. I had known this day would come sooner or later. I asked how they had found me. My assistant explained that they had somehow learned about the property and insisted on seeing me. They had been stopped by security because nobody could enter the estate without permission. I looked out the window toward the front entrance. Even from a distance, I recognized their car. I thought carefully before making my decision. Finally, I told security to bring them to the guest meeting room. I wasn't inviting them into my home. I was simply agreeing to hear what they had to say. A few minutes later, they walked inside. The room was quiet. My mother looked older than I remembered. The stress on her face was impossible to hide. Briggs looked nervous but tried to act confident. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Briggs broke the silence. "So, this place is really yours." I nodded once. He looked around the room before forcing a small smile. "Well, we're family," he said. "Families help each other. We should put everything behind us." His words didn't sound sincere. They sounded desperate. My mother suddenly began crying. She admitted she had made a terrible mistake. She said she should have listened to me instead of believing accusations without proof. She asked if I could forgive her. I listened quietly without interrupting. When she finished speaking, I looked at both of them. I remember another night, I said calmly. The night I stood outside with one suitcase. Neither of them answered. I had nowhere to sleep. I had nowhere to go. The room remained silent. I needed my family that night. I wasn't raising my voice. I wasn't angry. I simply spoke the truth. But on that night, being family didn't matter. My mother lowered her head. Briggs became impatient. He leaned forward and said they were about to lose the house. He explained they needed money immediately and that I could solve all their problems without even noticing the amount. He acted as though my success automatically belonged to him. I looked directly at him. The first thing you asked about wasn't how I've been, I said. It was my money. He had no answer. The silence became uncomfortable. I stood from my chair. I agreed to meet because I wanted to hear you, I said. Now I've heard everything. Neither of them looked the same as they did on the day I left home. The difference was that I no longer felt the need to beg for acceptance. For the first time in my life, I knew my own worth. And nothing they said could take that away. The room stayed quiet after my last words. My mother wiped the tears from her face, but Briggs still looked frustrated. It was clear that he had expected this meeting to end very differently. He believed I would write a check, solve every problem, and pretend the past had never happened. That wasn't going to happen. I sat back down and looked at both of them. I'm not here to punish either of you, I said calmly. But I'm also not going to pretend nothing happened. Briggs crossed his arms. So you're just going to let us lose everything? I shook my head. I didn't say that. I opened a folder that had been prepared before the meeting. My grandfather created a charitable housing foundation years ago, I explained. It helps people who are going through difficult times. The program offers temporary housing, financial planning, and support until they can get back on their feet. I turned toward my mother. If you're willing to accept the rules of that program, I'll arrange for you to enter it. She looked surprised. You would still help me? She asked quietly. I'll help you rebuild, I answered. But I won't hand you money. She nodded slowly, understanding that this wasn't a gift. It was a chance to start over. Then I looked at Briggs. As for you, the answer is no. His expression changed immediately. What do you mean, no? You've blamed other people for your choices for years, I replied. You still haven't admitted what you did. Until you accept responsibility for your actions, nothing will change. He stood up from his chair. So you forgive Mom but not me. I didn't say that either. I kept my voice steady. Forgiveness and trust are two different things. He stared at me, waiting for me to change my mind. I didn't. You want money, I continued. What you really need is accountability. Briggs became angry. He accused me of acting superior because I had become wealthy. I didn't argue with him. There was no reason to. My mother finally spoke. So Ellen is right, she said softly. Briggs looked at her in disbelief. For the first time, she wasn't defending him. He stormed out of the room without another word. After he left, my mother apologized again. I told her that rebuilding a life takes time and honest effort. No amount of money could replace that. Before leaving, she thanked me for giving her an opportunity instead of turning her away. After they were gone, I stood by the window and watched their car disappear through the front gates. I didn't feel victorious. I felt peaceful. Real revenge wasn't making them suffer. It was refusing to become the bitter person they expected me to be. I had stopped chasing their approval. And that freedom was worth more than anything money could buy. Months passed, and my life became busier than I had ever imagined. Every week brought new projects, new meetings, and new opportunities to grow the businesses my grandfather had left behind. I no longer felt like the confused man who had arrived at the mansion with nothing but questions. I had found my purpose. Instead of thinking only about making more money, I wanted to build something that would help other people. One of my first decisions was to create a scholarship program in my grandfather's name. It gave hardworking students a chance to continue their education without worrying about financial problems. Every application reminded me of how difficult life could become when nobody believed in you. I also approved several affordable housing projects across California. I knew what it felt like to lose your home overnight. I never wanted families to face that fear if I could help prevent it. As our companies expanded, we hired hundreds of new employees. Whenever possible, I visited construction sites, offices, and community projects in person. I shook hands with workers, listened to their ideas, and thanked them for their efforts. Many of them were surprised that the owner spent time speaking with everyone instead of hiding in an office. The truth was simple. I never forgot where I came from. I knew what it felt like to work long hours without being noticed. Because of that, I treated every employee with respect. The executives often told me that people worked harder because they trusted me. That meant more to me than any business award ever could. Meanwhile, my mother continued trying to rebuild her own life. One evening, she saw a television report about our newest housing project. The reporter spoke about the jobs we had created and the families who would soon have safe places to live. She quietly watched the entire program. When my interview appeared on the screen, I spoke about kindness, responsibility, and giving people a second chance. I never mentioned my family. I never spoke about the past. When the interview ended, my mother sat silently, realizing that the son she had rejected had become the kind of man any parent should be proud of. The regret on her face was something no one could erase. Briggs, however, refused to change. He continued blaming other people for every problem in his life. Whenever a job didn't work out, he claimed the manager was unfair. Whenever someone stopped helping him, he said they had betrayed him. People slowly stopped believing his excuses. Friends kept their distance. Opportunities disappeared. Trust became harder and harder for him to earn. Watching everything unfold taught me an important lesson. Success isn't measured only by the size of your house or the amount of money in your bank account. It's measured by the lives you improve along the way. That was the future I wanted to build. And every day, I moved one step closer to becoming the man my grandfather had always believed I could be. Several months later, I received a letter from a professional mediator. My mother had requested one final meeting. She wasn't asking for money or another favor. She simply wanted one last chance to speak honestly. After thinking about it for several days, I agreed. The meeting was held in a quiet office with the mediator present. Everything was calm. There were no raised voices and no arguments before we even sat down. My mother looked nervous. For a few moments, she couldn't find the words. Finally, she looked at me and began speaking. "I spent years treating you and Briggs differently," she said. "I always believed you were strong enough to handle anything. I thought he needed more protection." She paused as tears filled her eyes. I was wrong. She admitted that every time Briggs made a mistake, she rushed to defend him. Whenever I struggled, she expected me to solve my own problems without help. She realized that she had mistaken my kindness for weakness. She had depended on me while giving someone else all the attention. "I never saw how much you were carrying," she whispered. I listened quietly. There was nothing left to argue about. She already knew the truth. After a long silence, I thanked her for finally being honest. Then I spoke carefully. "I forgive you." She looked up with hope in her eyes. Before she could say anything else, I continued. "But forgiveness doesn't mean everything goes back to the way it was." Her smile slowly faded. "I don't hate you," I said. "But I have to protect the life I've built. Some boundaries can't be removed." She nodded slowly. For the first time, she accepted my decision without trying to change it. At that moment, the office door opened. Briggs walked in. He had not been invited to speak, but he ignored that. He immediately began complaining. He said I had changed because of money. He claimed our mother was blaming herself for things that weren't her fault. Then he pointed at me. "You think you're better than everyone now." I calmly looked at him. "No," I answered. "I simply stopped accepting what was never right." He continued making excuses for every choice he had made. Nothing was ever his responsibility. Nothing was ever his mistake. The mediator quietly asked him several questions, but every answer blamed someone else. My mother sat silently, listening to him. Then she slowly lowered her head. For the first time, she truly saw the difference between her two sons. One accepted responsibility. The other avoided it. She finally understood that the son she had called strong had been carrying the family for years without asking for praise. The son she had protected had never learned to stand on his own. When the meeting ended, my mother thanked me for coming. We walked in different directions. There was sadness between us, but there was also peace. Some relationships can heal. Others can only move forward with honesty, respect, and healthy distance. Several years passed, and life became calmer than I ever imagined it could be. One evening, I stood on the balcony of my Malibu mansion as the sun slowly disappeared behind the Pacific Ocean. The waves moved peacefully below, and the cool breeze reminded me how different my life had become. When I first arrived here, I thought this house was the greatest gift I had ever received. Now I understood it was only a symbol. The mansion was never the real victory. The real victory was finding peace after years of pain. I thought back to the night my mother threw my suitcase onto the lawn and told me I would never own anything. At that moment, I believed my life was over. I had walked away with nothing except a broken heart. Looking back, I realized that painful night had actually opened the door to a better future. If I had never been forced to leave, I might never have discovered the life my grandfather had prepared for me. More importantly, I might never have discovered my own worth. The companies continued to grow, but I no longer measured success by money alone. I measured it by the families who found homes through our housing projects. I measured it by the students who graduated because of our scholarships. I measured it by the employees who built stable lives through honest work. Those achievements meant far more than numbers on a financial report. My relationship with my mother also changed over the years. She continued rebuilding her own life with quiet humility. She respected the boundaries I had set and never asked me to erase the past. From time to time, we spoke politely. There was kindness between us again, even though things would never return to what they once were. Some broken trust can be repaired. Some can only be accepted. She finally understood the difference. Briggs chose a different path. He continued blaming other people for every failure. Whenever something went wrong, he searched for someone else to hold responsible instead of looking at himself. As the years passed, fewer people stayed in his life. Without trust, relationships slowly disappeared. That was a choice only he could change. I no longer felt anger toward him. I simply wished he would one day accept responsibility for his own future. As the last light faded across the ocean, I smiled quietly. The greatest revenge had never been owning a $50 million mansion. It had never been becoming richer than the people who hurt me. Real victory came from refusing to let bitterness control my life. It came from choosing kindness without allowing myself to be used again. It came from learning that forgiveness does not require forgetting, and love does not require sacrificing your self-respect. I closed my eyes for a moment and silently thanked my grandfather for believing in me before I believed in myself. Everything I had today began with the worst night of my life. And in the end, I realized that nobody could ever take away my peace, my integrity, or the life I had built with them.